A 5-year-old girl in an old yellow dress walked to the front of a packed courtroom and looked up at the judge sitting in a wheelchair and said, clearly and without flinching, "Free my father. I'll make your legs work again." The courtroom laughed. The prosecutor shook his head. People whispered. A reporter in the back was already typing. But the judge didn't laugh, because the moment that little girl placed her hand on top of hers, something moved through her that she hadn't felt in 3 years. And she made a decision that no one in that room, including herself, fully understood. They gave it 30 days. They said it was impossible. They said it was dangerous. They said a child had no business making promises like that in a court of law. Then the 30 days passed. And what happened inside that courtroom on the final morning is the reason we're here today. If stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things are what you're looking for, this channel is where you'll find them. Hit subscribe before we go any further so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The town of Claremont, Georgia had a way of making things feel permanent. The cracks in the sidewalks never got repaired. The same families sat in the same pews every Sunday. And if you were the kind of man who showed up to a courthouse in a borrowed tie, people had already decided what they thought of you before the bailiff called your name. Marcus Webb was that kind of man. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of hauling lumber and pouring concrete, with hands that were always slightly gray no matter how hard he scrubbed them. He lived on the east side of Claremont, the part of town the local paper called the working class corridor, when it was being polite and said nothing about at all when it wasn't. His apartment had one window that faced a brick wall, a kitchen that smelled like the neighbor's cooking, and a second-hand mattress in the bedroom where his daughter slept. His wife, Denise, had died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Caught too late, treated too slowly. Marcus didn't talk about it. He had learned that grief was something you carried the way you carried a heavy load on a job site, quietly, with your jaw set, because putting it down wasn't an option. What he did talk about, what he held on to the way a man holds on to the only thing left in his pocket, was this: we may be poor, but we are not small. He said it to Lily at breakfast. He said it when she asked why their car made that sound. He said it when kids at her school said things that made her come home quiet. Lily Webb was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark, and still in a way that made grown people feel uncomfortably like she was listening to something they couldn't hear. She didn't talk much around strangers, but she watched everything. The way a person's shoulders changed when they were lying. The way someone's voice went thin when they were scared but pretending not to be. She couldn't have named any of this. She just knew things the way young children sometimes do before the world teaches them to stop trusting what they feel. She was not magic. That would be the easy explanation, and easy explanations were almost never right. She was simply a child who had not yet learned to look away. Across town, in a different Claremont entirely, the one with oak trees lining the streets and houses that had names instead of numbers, Judge Eleanor Hartley lived alone in a 2-story home she no longer used the second floor of. She was 53. She had served on the bench for 19 years. She was known, depending on who you asked, as either the most principled judge in Caldwell County or the coldest one. The truth, as it usually did, lived somewhere in the space between those two descriptions. 3 years ago, a delivery truck had run a red light on the corner of 5th and Marsh. Eleanor had been the one crossing. The surgeons had done what they could. The spinal cord damage, her doctor explained with the careful neutrality of someone who had delivered this kind of news before, was permanent. She would not walk again. She had accepted this the way she accepted most things, by filing it away and continuing to work. She was back on the bench within 8 months. She did not discuss her condition in court. She did not discuss it anywhere. What she had buried, along with any discussion of it, was something harder to name. The memory of who she had been before. A woman who had danced in her kitchen on Sunday mornings. A woman who had believed privately and a little fiercely that some things could not be explained and did not need to be. That woman felt very far away now. And then there was Greg Dalton, the assistant district attorney who had been handed the case of State versus Webb on a Tuesday afternoon and seen in it without meaning to be cruel about it, an opportunity. He was 31, ambitious in the specific way of someone who had worked very hard to get somewhere and was not planning to stop. He was not a bad man. He was something more dangerous than a bad man. He was a man who had learned to process people as cases and call it professionalism. These were the 4 people that Claremont, Georgia brought together on a Thursday morning in October. None of them were ready for what was about to happen. It started with a fever. Lily woke up on a Wednesday night burning. Marcus put his hand on her forehead and felt the heat radiating off her skin like something left too long in the sun. He checked the cabinet above the sink, the one where he kept the small things that passed for a medicine supply. A half-empty bottle of cough syrup, 2 expired allergy tablets, a box of bandages. No fever reducer. The last of it had run out 10 days ago, and Marcus had told himself he would replace it when the next paycheck came in. The next paycheck was 4 days away. He sat on the edge of Lily's mattress and watched her breathe. Her chest rose and fell in short, shallow pulls. Her lips were dry. She wasn't crying. Lily rarely cried. But her eyes, when they opened and found his face, had that glassy, faraway look that scared him more than crying would have. He did the math the way poor people learn to do math. Not with a calculator, but with a kind of grim, practiced arithmetic that lives in the chest. The $23 in his wallet, the bus fare he needed to get to the job site tomorrow, the electricity bill that was already 2 weeks late, a box of children's fever reducer at the 24-hour pharmacy on Clement Street cost $8. He could cover it, technically. But covering it meant the bus fare didn't happen, and if the bus fare didn't happen, he missed a shift. And if he missed a shift, the electricity bill got further away, and the whole careful architecture of a life built on nothing collapsed the way those structures always did. Not all at once, but in a sequence, each piece taking the next one down. He looked at Lily. She looked back at him. He grabbed his jacket. The pharmacy on Clement Street was empty at 11:40 at night, except for a teenager working the register who was watching something on his phone with one earbud in. The fever reducer was on the 3rd shelf of aisle 4, in a small yellow box with a picture of a smiling child on the front. Marcus stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and walked toward the door. He made it 12 steps into the parking lot. The security camera above the exit had caught everything: the reach, the pocket, the walk. The teenager at the register had seen it too, more than Marcus had realized. The police arrived in 4 minutes. Marcus didn't run. He stood in the parking lot with his hands slightly away from his sides and told the officers, clearly and without anger, what had happened. He told them about Lily. He told them about the paycheck. He told them the box was still in his pocket, unopened. They arrested him anyway. They were technically required to. By the following morning, the case had landed on Greg Dalton's desk. By that afternoon, Dalton had reviewed the file, noted Marcus's clean record, and made his recommendation anyway: 18 months. It wasn't personal. That was the thing that Marcus would never quite be able to make sense of. How something could upend a person's life without being personal. Dalton had a metric. First-time offenders in theft cases in Caldwell County received sentences in the range of 12 to 24 months. 18 was the midpoint. It was, by the logic of the system, fair. The local news ran the story the next evening. The headline read, "Claremont man arrested for pharmacy theft, claimed it was for sick child." The word "claimed" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. A neighbor named Mrs. Patricia Odom, who was 68 and had known Marcus since he moved into the building, took Lily for the night. Lily sat on Mrs. Odom's couch with her fever coming down and her father's jacket folded in her lap. And she did not ask where he was because she already understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before anyone tells them, that wherever he was, it wasn't somewhere good. The courtroom was the kind of room that had been designed, consciously or not, to make people feel small. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, rows of benches that filled quickly on the morning of Marcus Webb's sentencing hearing, because word had gotten around, not about Marcus specifically, but about the story. The sick child, the $8 box of medicine, the man with no record standing in a parking lot with his hands out. Claremont was a small town, and small towns had a way of turning other people's worst days into something to talk about over coffee. Marcus sat at the defense table in the only suit he owned, a dark gray jacket that had belonged to his father-in-law and pants that almost matched. His court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Brian Foster, who had 11 other cases that week, sat beside him and had already advised him, quietly and with practiced resignation, to consider a plea. Mrs. Odom sat in the third row with Lily beside her. Lily was wearing a yellow dress, the one with the small white flowers along the collar that had been Denise's favorite. It was slightly too big for her now, the hem brushing her ankles, but Mrs. Odom had pressed it carefully that morning and Lily had not argued. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her feet not quite reaching the floor, watching the front of the room with a calm, focused attention that was unusual in a child her age. She watched Greg Dalton spread his papers across the prosecution table. She watched her father sit very straight in his chair and not look back at her, because she understood that he was trying to protect her from something by not making eye contact, even though the thing he was trying to protect her from was already here, already in the room, already in the air. She watched Judge Eleanor Hartley wheel herself through the side door and take her position at the bench. Eleanor Hartley had presided over several thousand hearings in 19 years. She had learned to enter a courtroom the way a surgeon enters an operating room, present, calibrated, with everything unnecessary stripped away. She arranged her papers, surveyed the room once, and called the session to order. Greg Dalton made his opening statement. His voice was clear and measured. He acknowledged the circumstances. He acknowledged the clean record. He recommended 18 months, citing consistency with county sentencing guidelines, and sat down. Brian Foster made the case for leniency. He mentioned Lily. He mentioned Denise. He used the word desperate 3 times. Eleanor listened with her hands folded and her expression giving nothing away. She was about to speak when the movement happened. It started small. A shift in the third row, a small yellow shape separating from the bench. Mrs. Odom reached out a hand to stop it and missed. Lily walked up the center aisle of the courtroom. She was 5 years old and small for her age, and the aisle was long, and every person in that room turned to watch her make the walk. Someone near the back let out a short, surprised sound that wasn't quite a laugh. A woman in the second row put her hand over her mouth. The court clerk half rose from his chair. No one stopped her. Later, the people who had been there would struggle to explain why. Something about the way she moved, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going, made the usual instinct to intervene feel wrong, like stepping into the path of something that had already decided its direction. She stopped in front of the bench. Judge Hartley looked down at her. Lily looked up. "Your Honor," the words came out clearly, without rehearsal, without trembling. She had heard Mrs. Odom use them once and had filed them away. "Please let my daddy go." She paused. Then, "I'll make your legs work again." The courtroom broke. It wasn't cruel laughter, or most of it wasn't. It was the reflex of people confronted with something that didn't fit any category they had available. A 5-year-old making a medical promise to a judge in the middle of a sentencing hearing was not a thing that had a box to go into, and so the room responded with the only release valve it had. Greg Dalton glanced at Brian Foster with an expression that required no translation. 2 men in the back row were shaking their heads. A reporter near the wall was already typing. Judge Hartley did not laugh. She sat very still and looked at the child in front of her. And the child, without self-consciousness, without calculation, reached out and placed her small hand on top of Eleanor Hartley's hand where it rested on the edge of the bench. It was the simplest gesture in the world, the kind a child makes without thinking, because a child does not yet know that you are not supposed to touch a judge. Eleanor felt it move through her like something warm and directionless. Not pain, not electricity, not anything she had a word for, just warmth, the kind she had almost forgotten existed. She looked at Lily for a long moment. Lily looked back. No performance, no fear, just a child who had decided to believe something and was waiting to see if anyone else would, too. Eleanor picked up her gavel. "I am postponing sentencing for 30 days. The murmur that went through the room was immediate. She let it settle, then continued, her voice steady. "If the terms of this arrangement are not fulfilled within that period, the defendant will face sentencing at the upper range of the prosecution's recommendation." She paused. "This court is adjourned." She did not explain herself further. She didn't know how to. She had made a decision that she could not justify under any framework she had spent 19 years building, and she had made it anyway, because something in the touch of a 5-year-old's hand had reached into a place she thought was sealed shut and reminded her that it wasn't. The courtroom emptied in a low, electric buzz of disbelief. Lily walked back down the aisle to where Mrs. Odom was sitting with both hands pressed to her face. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table and stared at the back of his daughter's head and could not speak. By the following morning, Claremont had an opinion. The story moved the way stories move in small towns, fast, and with details that shifted slightly each time. By breakfast, it was on the local radio. By noon, it was on the regional news website with a headline that read, "Judge Hartley delays sentencing after courtroom promise from defendant's 5-year-old daughter." By evening, the television news had picked it up, and the framing had already begun to calcify into something that wasn't quite the truth, but was easier to repeat. The editorial board of the Claremont Courier published a piece the next day titled, "When Emotion Overrides Justice." It did not mention Marcus Webb's name. It did not mention Lily's. It referred to Judge Hartley's decision as a troubling departure from judicial standards, and expressed concern about the integrity of the sentencing process. Dr. Raymond Okafor, who had been Eleanor Hartley's physician for 3 years, was reached by a reporter and asked to comment. He chose his words precisely. "The nature of Judge Hartley's spinal injury does not, based on current medical understanding, support the possibility of the kind of recovery being suggested." The reporter quoted him as saying recovery was impossible. It was close enough to what he meant that he didn't bother to correct it. Greg Dalton filed a formal motion requesting the court reconsider the delay. He cited procedural irregularities. He was not wrong to do so. He was, in his own way, trying to protect the system he believed in, a system that he understood, genuinely, as the thing standing between order and chaos. He simply could not see that the system he was protecting had already made its judgment about Marcus Webb the moment Marcus Webb walked into a parking lot with the wrong color skin and an $8 box of medicine in his pocket. The motion was denied. Eleanor Hartley denied it herself from her chambers without comment. Marcus was released on a supervised recognizance bond the afternoon after the hearing. He took the bus home. The apartment felt different when he unlocked the door. Smaller, or maybe he was just more aware of its edges now. He went to pick up Lily from Mrs. Odom's apartment down the hall. He carried her home on his back because she asked him to, even though she was getting too big for it. She looped her arms around his neck and he held her legs and they went the 12 steps down the hallway without saying anything. He put her to bed. Then he sat on the floor beside her mattress in the dark. After a while, he said quietly, "Do you know what you promised in there?" "Yes," Lily said. "Do you know how big that is?" A pause. It felt like the right size. He looked at her. In the thin light coming under the door, he could see her watching the ceiling with that particular expression she had, the one that meant she was working something out. "Lily," he kept his voice careful, "I don't want you to feel like you have to do something impossible." "I didn't promise something impossible," she said. "I promised something I didn't know how to do yet." He sat with that for a moment. There was a distinction in it, and he felt it, even if he couldn't immediately name what it was. "Baby, the whole town is laughing." "I know." She turned her head to look at him. "Were you laughing?" "No." "Was the judge laughing?" He was quiet. "No," he said. Lily nodded as if that settled it, and looked back at the ceiling. "Then those are the only two that matter." Marcus put his hand over his face and breathed for a moment. He was not a man who cried easily. He had learned by necessity to convert grief into action. to feel something and then move, because stillness was a luxury he had never been able to afford. But sitting on the floor in the dark beside his daughter, he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been clenching for 2 years. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against the side of her mattress. "Okay," he said. It was not agreement, exactly. It was not faith. It was just a man deciding that his 5-year-old daughter was, at this particular moment, wiser than he was, and choosing to act accordingly. Lily reached down and patted his head the way he usually patted hers. "Go to sleep, Daddy," she said. "We have things to do tomorrow." Nobody had told Lily where Eleanor Hartley went after court. She had figured it out the way she figured most things out, by paying attention. 2 days after the hearing, Mrs. Odom had taken her along on an errand that passed by the courthouse on Birchwood Avenue. Lily had watched from the car window as a dark sedan pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and turned left, heading in the direction of Garrison Park. She had filed that away. The next afternoon, she asked Marcus if she could go to the park. He said yes, because the park was 4 blocks away, and Lily had always had an unusual sense of direction for a 5-year-old, and because he was trying, carefully and imperfectly, to let her do the thing she had decided to do. She found Eleanor Hartley on the east path, beside the small man-made lake, parked in her wheelchair at the end of the paved walkway where the concrete gave way to grass. She was alone. She was looking at the water and not particularly seeing it. Lily walked up and stood beside her. Eleanor looked down. Something moved across her face. Not annoyance, not warmth, something more cautious than either. "You should go home," Eleanor said. "I will," Lily said. "Later." She sat down cross-legged on the concrete beside the wheelchair. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the water. They sat in silence for several minutes. A pair of ducks moved across the surface of the lake. A jogger passed on the far path. The late afternoon light came through the trees at a low angle and made everything look slightly more patient than it actually was. "What are you doing?" Eleanor finally asked. "Sitting with you," Lily said. "I can see that. Why?" Lily thought about it. "Because you looked like you were sitting alone, and that's different from sitting by yourself." Eleanor turned to look at the child. Lily was watching the ducks with a calm, unhurried expression. Eleanor opened her mouth, found nothing immediately useful to say, and closed it again. She came back the next day, and the day after. Eleanor stopped telling her to go home after the 3rd visit, partly because it hadn't worked, and partly because she had begun, against her own better judgment, to find herself at the east path at the same time each afternoon. She told herself it was coincidence. It was not coincidence. Lily asked questions the way children ask questions, without architecture, without agenda, whatever rose to the surface. What was her favorite color? Whether she had ever seen snow fall sideways. Whether she liked the smell of rain on concrete or rain on dirt better. Whether she had ever had a dog. What her mother had been like. That last one stopped Eleanor for a moment. She was practical, Eleanor said. She didn't have patience for nonsense. "Like you," Lily said. "Yes," Eleanor paused. "Like me. Do you miss her?" "Every day." Lily nodded as if this was the correct answer and she had been hoping for it. "My mama's gone too," she said. "Daddy says she's still around, just in a different way. I think he believes it, but it makes him sad to say it." Eleanor said nothing, but something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, a degree of tension releasing from somewhere around her shoulders. "What did you like to do?" Lily asked. "Before." Eleanor knew what the word "before" meant, in the way it was being used. She considered deflecting. She didn't. "I used to dance," she said. Lily looked up at her with immediate, uncomplicated interest. "What kind?" "Ballroom, mostly. Some jazz." She looked at her hands. "I was not especially talented, but I loved it." "Can you show me?" "I'm sitting in a wheelchair, child." Lily stood up, brushed off her dress, and held out both hands, palms up. "Show me with your hands, then." Eleanor stared at the small, outstretched hands in front of her. The offering was so straightforward, so entirely without irony, that it took her a moment to process it as real. She should have said no. It was an absurd thing. She was a 53-year-old sitting judge in a public park, and this was not something she did. She placed her hands in Lily's. Lily began to move them, GGK at first, following some rhythm she was hearing internally, lifting and dropping and turning their joined hands in slow arcs. Eleanor let herself be moved, and then gradually she began to move back, her wrists loosening, her arms finding the shape of something she had not felt in 3 years. They stayed like that for several minutes. It looked, to anyone watching from a distance, like something between foolish and beautiful. When they stopped, Eleanor became aware that her face was doing something it hadn't done in a long time. She was smiling. Not the small, controlled expression she wore in GGK, but an actual smile, the kind that reached the back of the eyes. Then she felt it. A GGK movement in her right foot. Not a spasm, she knew spasms. This was intentional. Faint and uncertain and entirely real. She looked down. Lily looked down. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Lily looked up and met her eyes, and her expression was not triumphant. It was not surprised. It was something quieter than either of those things. The look of a child who had believed something was possible and had just seen the first thin evidence that she might be right. Eleanor looked at the lake. Her hands were shaking slightly. She did not tell anyone had happened. Not that evening. Not the next day. She lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and tried to move her foot again and could not, and told herself she had imagined it. But she knew she had. The photograph appeared on a Thursday morning. It was on the front page of the Claremont Courier's website, a long lens shot taken from across the park, slightly grainy, showing Eleanor Hartley in her wheelchair and a small girl holding her hands. The image was not unflattering. It did not need to be. The headline did the work instead. Judge Hartley and defendant's daughter, emotional manipulation or genuine belief. The article quoted 3 legal experts, 2 of whom questioned whether the judge's continued contact with the defendant's child represented a conflict of interest. The third was more direct. He called it a troubling example of sentiment overriding the structural integrity of the judicial process. The article also quoted a child psychologist who had not met Lily, but was willing to speculate about the psychological burden being placed on a 5-year-old who had been positioned as a healer by circumstances beyond her control. By the time Marcus saw it, Lily had already seen it. She had been sitting at the kitchen table when he came out of the bedroom, and she had the look she got sometimes. Very still, very inward, like something had gone quiet inside her that was usually running. He sat down across from her. "You saw the paper," he said. She nodded. "What are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "They called me a trick, like I'm trying to fool her." Marcus kept his voice level. "I know. I'm not trying to fool her. I know that too." She looked down at the table. Her hands were in her lap. "What if they're right, though? What if I made her believe something that isn't true, and now she's going to fall because of me, and you're going to go to jail because of me, and it's all because I stood up and said something I didn't actually know how to do?" Her voice didn't break. Lily rarely let her voice break, but the words came out smaller than her usual words, compressed, like she was trying to take up less space with them. Marcus didn't answer right away. He had learned with Lily that the wrong answer given quickly did more damage than a right answer that took time to arrive. He got up, came around the table, and sat down on the floor. Not beside her chair, on the floor below her eye level, so she had to look down at him. She blinked. "What are you doing?" "Listening from down here," he said. "Sometimes it's easier." The corner of her mouth moved. He leaned his back against the cabinet and looked up at her. "You want to know what I saw that day in the courtroom? When you walked up there?" She nodded. "I saw 100 people who had already decided what was going to happen. And I saw you walk right through the middle of all that and look that woman in the eye like none of them were even in the room." He paused. "I've been trying to do that my whole life, and I've never managed it as clean as you did it at 5 years old." Lily looked at him steadily. "I didn't do it because I was brave," she said. "I did it because I didn't think about it first." That's what brave usually is, Marcus said. She sat with that. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went past, and then another. She's not fooled, Lily said finally. She knows I don't know how to fix things. She just forgot that she does. Marcus nodded slowly. Then keep reminding her. Lily got up from her chair, stepped over his legs, and went to get her shoes. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, day 22. Eleanor had taken to arriving at the park earlier than usual, before the after-work joggers, before the families with strollers, when the east path was still mostly quiet. She had not examined this habit too closely. Examining it would have required admitting what it meant, and she was not ready for that yet. She had been attempting on her own to navigate the slight downward slope at the end of the paved path, the one that curved toward the lake's edge. Her physical therapist had advised against unsupported movement on inclines. Her physical therapist was not there. The front wheel caught the edge where the asphalt had lifted slightly. The chair tilted. Eleanor reached for the armrest and missed. She went down sideways onto the concrete path, landing hard on her left shoulder and hip. She lay there for a moment, looking up at the sky through the tree canopy, doing the quiet internal inventory that people who have lived with physical limitation learn to perform automatically. Cataloging pain, checking for anything that felt wrong beyond the ordinary wrong. Her shoulder would bruise. Her hip would bruise. Nothing was broken. But someone had seen it. A man walking his dog on the far path had his phone out before Eleanor had finished her inventory. By evening, it was online. By morning, it was everywhere. Greg Dalton held a press briefing on the courthouse steps the following day. He was measured, as he always was, and that measured quality made what he said land harder. This arrangement has now resulted in a sitting judge sustaining a physical injury in a public park, he said. We have an obligation, not to any ideology, not to any sentiment, but to the safety and dignity of the people this court is meant to serve. We will be formally requesting termination of the delay and immediate resumption of standard sentencing proceedings. He was not wrong about the injury. He was not wrong about the obligation. He was wrong about what was actually happening, but he didn't have the vocabulary for what was actually happening, and that was not entirely his fault. The medical community weighed in again. A neurologist from Atlanta who had reviewed Eleanor's case files was quoted extensively. The piece ended with his assessment that any appearance of neurological recovery was almost certainly attributable to psychological suggestion and wishful interpretation. Eleanor read it in her chambers alone with the door closed. That evening she called Lily, not her attorney, not her physician, not any of the colleagues who had been calling her with increasing urgency for the past week. She called the cell phone of Marcus Webb, who handed it to his daughter without asking why, because some things did not require explanation. "Are you still willing?" Eleanor asked. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation, just Lily making sure she understood the question. "Yes," she said. Eleanor stayed on the line for another moment, not speaking, just holding the phone in the dark of her living room with the lamp unlit and the street noise coming in from outside. "All right," she said finally. "I'll see you Thursday." She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. On the morning of day 30, Marcus woke before the alarm. He ironed his gray jacket with the small travel iron they kept under the sink, pressing the lapels flat with careful, deliberate movements. He polished his shoes with a cloth and a little dish soap because he didn't have polish. He made oatmeal, which was what they had, and he and Lily ate it at the kitchen table in the early light without saying very much. He combed her hair and put in the barrettes that had been Denise's, small white ones, shaped like daisies. Lily sat still and let him. When he was done, she looked up at him. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Very," he said. "Me too." She reached up and took his hand. "Let's be scared together." He held her hand and did not let go until they reached the courthouse steps. The courtroom was full in a way it hadn't been even on the first day. People had come from outside Claremont, reporters from the regional affiliates, a blogger who covered human interest stories, 2 women from a church group in the next county who had driven 90 minutes because they felt, without being able to say exactly why, that they needed to be present. The benches were packed. People stood along the back wall. The air had the particular quality of a room full of people who were all pretending to be calmer than they were. Marcus sat at the defense table in his gray jacket. Brian Foster sat beside him with a legal pad and an expression that said he had stopped predicting outcomes and was simply waiting now, like everyone else. Lily sat in the front row with her white daisy barrettes catching the light from the high windows. She did not look around the room. She watched the side door. Greg Dalton sat at the prosecution table with his files arranged in front of him. He had prepared thoroughly, as he always did. He had his argument and his precedents and his procedural timeline. He was ready to proceed. At 9:02 in the morning, the side door opened. Eleanor Hartley wheeled herself to the bench. She looked, to those who watched her carefully, like a woman who had not slept well but had made a decision sometime in the night and was at peace with it in the way that people are at peace with hard decisions. Not happily, but completely. She arranged her papers. She surveyed the room. Her gaze moved across the prosecution table, the defense table, the gallery, and stopped briefly at the front row, where a small girl in white daisy barrettes was watching her with an expression of complete, uncomplicated steadiness. Eleanor held that gaze for one moment. Then she called the session to order. Greg Dalton presented his case first. He was concise and professional. The 30-day period had elapsed. No documented medical recovery had been confirmed by any licensed physician. The terms of the arrangement had not been fulfilled by any measurable standard. He requested immediate sentencing within the recommended range. He sat down. Brian Foster made a brief statement. He cited Marcus's clean record, his circumstances, his daughter's age. He asked the court for mercy. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at her papers for a long moment. Then she set them to one side. "Before I render judgment," she said, "I'm going to ask that one person approach the bench." The room shifted. People exchanged glances. Dalton looked up from his notes. Eleanor looked at the front row. "Lily," she said. Lily got up from the bench and walked up the second aisle for the second time. This time no one laughed. No one made a sound. The room watched her walk with the same quality of attention you give to something you sense is important. Not knowing why yet, just knowing. She stopped in front of the bench. She was smaller than she had seemed from a distance. The bench rose above her considerably. She looked up at Eleanor Hartley, and Eleanor looked down at her. And for a moment, the courtroom, the reporters, the gallery, the 30 days and everything that had accumulated in them, all of it seemed to narrow down to the space between those two faces. Lily didn't say anything right away. She reached up. She had to rise slightly onto her toes to do it, and placed her hand over Eleanor's hand where it rested at the edge of the bench. The same gesture as the first day, simple and direct, and entirely without calculation. She said, quietly enough that the people in the back had to lean forward, "You already remembered how to believe. You just have to let yourself do it out loud." Eleanor looked at the small hand on top of hers. The courtroom held its breath. Eleanor Hartley placed both palms flat on the surface of the bench in front of her. She closed her eyes. She breathed in, slowly, deliberately, the way a person breathes when they are asking something of themselves that they are not certain they can deliver. And then she stood up. It was not graceful. Her arms shook with the effort. Her legs, when they took weight, took it unevenly. The left more than the right barely at all. She was not standing the way a person stands when they have been standing their whole life. She was standing the way a person stands when they are doing it for the first time again, with the entire focused will of someone who has decided that the distance between sitting and standing is worth everything it costs. She stood for 6 seconds, maybe 7. Then she lowered herself back into the chair. The courtroom did not applaud. It did not erupt. It did what a room full of people does when something happens that none of them have a ready response for. It went completely, absolutely silent. Greg Dalton sat very still at the prosecution table. His pen was in his hand. He did not appear to be aware of it. He was looking at the bench with the expression of a man whose categories have just failed him entirely and who does not yet know what to replace them with. In the front row, Mrs. Odom was crying quietly into a folded tissue. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table with his head bowed and both hands pressed flat against his thighs, and he did not move for a long moment. Eleanor Hartley straightened in her chair. She picked up her gavel. When she spoke, her voice was steady. The court finds that the terms of this arrangement have been fulfilled to the satisfaction of this bench. She looked directly at Marcus. Marcus Webb, the charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go. She paused. Then she set the gavel down and spoke again, not as a judge delivering a ruling, but as a person saying something she needed to say out loud. I have spent 19 years in this room believing that justice and mercy were separate instruments, that you used one or the other depending on what the law required. I no longer believe that. She looked out at the gallery. I was reminded of this by a 5-year-old child who walked into this courtroom with nothing except the conviction that it was worth trying. A pause. I am not embarrassed by that. I think we should all be paying closer attention. She picked up her gavel one final time and struck it once. This court is adjourned. The room came back to life slowly. Voices, movement, the scrape of benches. Reporters were already moving toward the doors. Someone was calling someone on a cell phone. Marcus stood up from the defense table. Lily was already there, having crossed the room in the time it took everyone else to process what had happened. She walked into him, and he picked her up and held her the way he'd held her when she was an infant. Both arms, her face against his neck, the whole small weight of her. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Across the room, Eleanor Hartley was speaking quietly with her clerk. She looked composed. She looked like herself, or more precisely, she looked like a version of herself that was slightly more continuous with the woman she had been before the accident than the one she had been yesterday. She would undergo further evaluation the following week. The neurologist who reviewed the findings used words like unexpected and incomplete recovery and requires ongoing observation. He did not use the word miracle. He was a careful man, and careful men do not use that word lightly. Eleanor did not use it either. But late that evening, alone in her house, she turned on the small speaker in the kitchen and played the song she had always danced to on Sunday mornings, a slow, wandering jazz standard that her mother had loved. And she sat in her wheelchair and moved her hands through the air and felt, distinctly and unmistakably, both of her feet respond. She didn't call anyone. She just sat in her kitchen and let herself feel it. The people who had laughed that first morning went home from the courthouse and did not talk about the laughter. Not because they were ashamed, or not only because of that, but because somewhere on the drive home, a question had lodged itself in them that they couldn't shake loose. A 5-year-old girl had walked into a room full of certainty and offered something that had no business working. And something had shifted. Not everything, not the town or the system or the particular arithmetic of poverty that had put Marcus Webb in that parking lot on a Wednesday night with an $8 box of medicine in his pocket. Those things were still there, still in need of repair, as stubborn and cracked as the sidewalks that never got fixed. But one man was going home to his daughter, and one woman had remembered what it felt like to stand. And a child had kept a promise, not the way anyone expected, but in the only way that had ever mattered. By believing it first. There's a version of this story where we talk about what was really behind Eleanor Hartley's recovery. The neurology, the psychology, the months of sitting in a park with a little girl who asked her what she liked to do before. Maybe it was all of that. Maybe it was something else entirely. The story doesn't claim to know. What it does know is this. Most of us stop believing somewhere along the way. Not all at once, gradually, the way a room goes dark not when the light goes out, but in the slow minutes after. We learn to call it wisdom. We learn to call it realism. We learn to nod along when someone says that's just not how the world works. And we forget that we used to know, the way Lily knew, that the world works exactly the way we decide it does when we're willing to walk up to the front of the room and say so. Marcus Webb taught his daughter one thing above everything else. We may be poor, but we are not small. She took that lesson into a courtroom and aimed it at a woman who had forgotten she was allowed to be anything other than diminished. And something moved. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you'd forgotten or someone you know, or a version of yourself that used to believe things before the world got to you, share it. That's how these stories find the people who need them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. Every week we bring you stories like this one, about ordinary people who chose to believe something when the room told them not to. We'd love for you to be here for the next one.